Hello, humans. This is case studies about ice water from a doctor named Zhang Zihe. I've done a number of his cases. He had a lot of cases on emotions, but he had cases on other things that I've recorded for you. He is the so-called founder of the school of attacking and purging or attacking and making bowel movements. He was a very aggressive doctor who perceived most things as excess, and he thought the solution to pretty much everything was vomiting or sweating or inducing a bowel movement. And he was one of the four great masters of the Jinyuan dynasty. So this is he's one of the few doctors I've come across that actually thought ice water could be therapeutic. So I want you to know this is non-standard. Most doctors say ice is not very good for you, whether you're drinking it or applying it topically. There are all kinds of cases where somebody fell into icy water and now they're sick, or drank or ate cold foods and now they're sick. But well, John to Huss, sometimes there's like one case. This is going to have three parts. So this first part are just some cases of his as well as some, introductory information. And then the second part has three cases from his own household, including one of himself when he was sick. The third part has like I think one more case and then a few more small things and then one case where actually ice water was a problem. So anyway, so these three are going to be stuff. And there were even more cases involving ice water, drinking ice water from him, but not all of them were interesting. So I picked the best ones, at least in my opinion. Anyway, he wrote a book called Rumen Shirqin, and forgive my pronunciation. um, and he's also called Zhang Zongjang. But in his book, he calls himself Dairen all the time. Dairen. So whenever a case says they invited Dairen to treat the patient, it's Zhang. And you can see the date. So this is like 800 years ago, Jin Dynasty. And here are a few random quotes that aren't necessarily from cases where he's talking about ice water. He said, ice water is used to relieve internal dryness. Okay, well, that kind of makes sense. I could see water for dryness. Does it have to be ice water? I don't know. He says, yeah. And here's another thing you can see. It's almost like a poem, although it doesn't seem to rhyme. And he says, swallowing ice water stops cholera. Drinking flowing water frees retention of urine. Since the water is flowing, that helps promote flow in the body. Okay. Washing the eyes with snow water reduces redness. Oh, okay. Bathing the flesh in salt water dries up sores. So, this one's a little different, salt water, but anyway, I thought I'd give the whole sentence. Okay. So, ice water stops cholera, he says. Here's another random quotes from various places. Do not recklessly use herbs when treating Shanghan, when treating cold damage. Simply drinking water is the best medicine. Wow. That is so unusual. Whenever one descends a patient, the word, I've talked about this before, but to induce a bowel movement, the verb is actually sha, which means to descend. And so the emphasis there is that you're moving chi downward, which of course will induce a bowel movement, but he's using this for while the word descend can mean other things, but he's using this here for inducing a bowel movement. So whenever somebody uses herbs to induce a bowel movement, but then the patient has diarrhea and it doesn't stop, use ice water to resolve it. And we'll see a case like that. I forget if it's today or in one of the later ones, but we will see cases where the person doesn't stop having diarrhea after he uses da huang or whatever. And then he has them drink ice water and they're better. When herbs are hot, the bowels move. They stop when cold. Okay. Uh, and also, I don't have an exact quote for this because it was part of a longer sentence and passage, but he also prescribed ice water after he induced vomiting because he was a big one on inducing vomiting. Anyway, so ice water after vomiting if the patient felt dizzy or thirsty. And he'd often, for like actually for these other things too, he'd often, um, you know, list or recommend water, melons, pears, persimmons, and other cooling foods. Um, it didn't have to be ice water all the time, but like very cold, fresh fruits, which, as you probably know, aren't generally looked upon as being appropriate for patients. So here's our first one that we're going to talk about. Cough due to taxation, which means that the person is, overworked so much that they're really deeply depleted, worse than just plain old deficiency. Okay, so a taxation cough is often things like tuberculosis in modern terms, although I'm not saying that's what this one is. Okay, so here's the case. Somebody named Mr. Gao was from somewhere, we don't care. He had been sick with cough for a year and a half, and he also had been having tinnitus for 3 months. His cough had pus and blood in it, and his face had many black spots on it. The exterior of his body was very hot, and his throat couldn't make sounds. In other words, he couldn't speak. So Dairen, Zhang Zihe said, the source of the cough is heart fire triumphing. What does that mean? Fire melts metal. Okay, so he's having a cough because heart fire is melting the metal of the lungs. When there's injury by dampness in autumn, cough is engendered in winter. This is not an exact quote from Suen chapter 3 or Suen chapter 5, but it's similar to things that are said in both of those chapters. Okay, so when somebody's exposed to dampness in autumn, autumn is dryness, so dampness is the opposite. That can easily cause problem. Then they'll have cough in winter. So water is at its peak in winter. It's the strongest in winter. When water and dampness connect with each other, it's kind of like double yin. They become cut off from fire. So, water tends to be below, fire tends to be above. Now fire can't descend, and so it flares up more than it should. And when it flares up, then lungs are receiving the flames. So when lung metal receives the flames, then fire melts metal and it becomes cough. When the metal is exposed to these flames for a long time, then they lose their voice. Sounds can't be expressed. So he's saying to the patient, the doctors who supplemented your lungs and kidneys were all wrong. What he thinks needs to be done is that heart fire needs to be cooled and, the damp and water need to be dealt with. So he's using a lot of 5-element explanation there. So Dairen first made sure that the patient had things like watermelon, ice, and snow, to help get rid of the fire. Next, he used the method of inducing vomiting and diarrhea because there are fluids below diarrhea to get them out because there's fire above. Maybe that's why there's vomiting, or hopefully some of the fluids will also go out through the vomiting. He also gave the patient herbs to remove dampness, and the disease was gone in a day. So you could see here that the water or watermelon or ice were not the main treatment, but they were certainly, he used them therapeutically as part of the treatment. Here's the second case for, oh no, wait. Yeah, the second case, it's another taxation case. Deficiency taxation, yeah, it's just taxation, overwork. Somebody named Shu was from someplace and he was sick with deficiency taxation and he was sweating during sleep, but he's using a different term than the usual term for night sweats. I don't know why, but okay. His face was greenish yellow. He had cold pain without sweating from his knees down. So he's sweating while he sleeps, but his legs on down are cold and not sweating, or his knees on down. Okay, he felt hot and dry inside his abdomen, so heat above, cold below. A doctor had used ginger and futza to supplement him and did not let him drink water for 5 days and 5 nights. So this other doctors, wouldn't let him have any cold thing, even though he was sweating, and gave him extremely hot herbs. He also forbade combing his hair. Why? I don't know why. I really don't understand why combing the hair would cause a problem. But anyway, that's what it says. So he was treating this as cold, therefore he's using ginger and aconite. Okay, so Mr. Shu said, enough of that. I don't like that other doctor. Give me Dairen. So Dairen came and he said, oh, your disease is not difficult to cure, but it's going to be difficult for you to take good care of yourself after it's cured. I fear that after you recover, then you're going to go back to your old ways and just, want sex with everybody. And then you won't be careful. Mr. Shu said, I wouldn't dare do that. So Dairen first used some formulas. These cases are not about the formulas, and these formulas are not ones that you and I are going to use today, because they're ones that induce, violent vomiting or diarrhea or stuff like that. These are, so I'm not talking about these formulas, but he used these, really intense formulas. And the patient then had 5 or 7 bowel movements. That helped his heart fire to descend, because remember, inducing a bowel movement is a descending thing. Plus, if he's getting rid of some of the fluids, then fire and water might be better able to interact. So heart fire descended, he felt thirsty. Zhang gave him ice water to drink. He was also made to bathe, which would help cool off his body and so forth. Within several days, his face was red and lustrous in a good way. This is supposed to be a good thing. So afterwards, then Dairen had him boil rice porridge, jo or juk or kanji, whatever you want to call it. He had him boil rice porridge in river water to warm and nourish his spleen and stomach. River water can disinhibit urination. That means river water can help promote urination. Remember, it's running water, so it's going to promote flow. He also regulated the patient with this formula, Huoxie Dangui Wan. So let's see, where's that? Huoxue is enliven the blood, and then Dangui is an herb that you probably know what it is, pill. Also, some other pills, a ginseng and chaihu pill, Wuling San, promotes urination, right? And Mushang Baiju San, so some acrid, warm herbs. That's a lot of different formulas. Well, this is what Zhang Zihe did. The disease greatly recovered. His sweating while sleeping stopped. His feet became warmer each day, and he ate. Remember, he had cold feet before, cold legs, and so they warmed up. In other words, his body kind of regulated and everything, yeah, he lived happily ever after. So then there's some explanation after here. Dairen often said, and then the sentence doesn't make any sense to me. He says this is rooted in lung B. So, a B pattern is like generally painful obstruction of the joints, but there's also, heart B, which is, angina-like pains, or throat B, which is sore throat. So lung B is some kind of painful condition of the lungs. Well, whatever. We should use cooling prescriptions. And then he starts talking about water. Water, when we talk about water as a substance, in the eyes, it's tears. In the skin, it's sweat. In the lower body, it's urine. And so while it's normal to consume more grain, which refers to food as a whole, and less water, we eat more than we drink, a higher quantity of food than we drink, so it's normal to eat more food and drink less water, but can you live without water? This is if I understand the sentence. There's, some things, this is very old. This is 800 years old. It's hard to translate. So hopefully, I think I have the big picture. There may be some small errors. Anyway, If someone is forbidden to drink water, the water will become exhausted inside the body. And when water is exhausted inside the body, dry heat is engendered. If someone is not thirsty, they're going to refuse to drink when you give them water. Okay, so that's a whole, kind of just him describing some stuff. And then how did this turn out in the end? Mr. Shu has recovered, but if he forgets the prohibitions, the disease will relapse. In other words, if he starts eating randomly and having sex all over the place, the disease will relapse. So after Dairen left town, because he traveled quite a bit, Mr. Shu died. He must have been having lots of sex. Anyway, okay, there's that case. Here comes another one. This one is like actually more interesting for the sociology of it. A man married into his wife's family. So that was a thing. If, a family only had daughters and didn't have any sons in ancient Chinese culture, there was nobody who could pray to the ancestors and make offerings. Only males could really do that. And, nobody to carry on the family name. And so sometimes what they'd do, if they had resources, is they'd marry their daughter to somebody and have him move in and then change his name to the wife's family name. So he's kind of like adopted as a son for the family. And then the wife, instead of marrying out to her husband's family, the husband marries in. So that's not super common, but it was common enough. So this man married into his wife's family, and then he got sick and he had jaundice. He liked to eat, but even though he was eating, he was still emaciated and he was weak. He couldn't even lift his limbs. His face was yellow and he was feeble. His wife's father, his father-in-law, wanted to abandon him, just say, get out of here. You're not our problem. You're not our son, really, not really. But the wife was unwilling. She said, hey, I've already got 2 children from him. Like, who else is going to marry me? I'm not 100% sure that's what that says, but it's something like that. The wife's father was a farmer. He summoned his son-in-law, wanting to make him work. Even though he was sick, I don't care. He's got to work. If he wants to eat, he better work. And he saw that his son-in-law was really extremely ill and then shamed and insulted him every day. Isn't that horrible? Yeah. Someone taught the patient to take some pills. I don't know what these pills are again. This is not really about the herbal formulas, but sun lung is a pretty powerful herb. But they didn't help. He then used Akumaxa and he did, prayers for protection. He tried 100 things, but none of them helped. So Dairen to the rescue. Dairen comes to see him, and he didn't even bother to take his pulse. He didn't bother to do the diagnosis thing. Instead, he just induced vomiting. He took look at this guy and said, this guy needs to vomit, because that's who Dairen was. And so the vomiting removed 1 dole of accumulated phlegm and lodged water. How big is a dole? It's like a basket. It's a measure of grain. It's pretty big. He also used some drain water formula. Is that what that would be? Where does it have it? Yeah, like drain water pills, and some free the channel powder. The patient had 40 or 50 bowel movements. They just didn't stop. So Dairen ordered him to drink a jar of ice water, and then it immediately stopped. We saw that in the very beginning, that was one of the things that he said. Okay. Next, he took some normal formulas like Pingwei-san, alternating with a Binglong formula for 5 or 7 days. The jaundice abated, he grew stronger again. And then he says, this must have been a spleen jaundice condition due to damp heat wrestling with lodged grains. So in other words, like food stagnation and damp heat all bound up together made, jaundice is a damp condition. So yeah, this is commonly called golden taxation jaundice, Or that could say metal taxation jaundice, but I don't think that makes sense. Anyway, um, yeah, so that's kind of an interesting story about like the family. What a nasty father-in-law. Okay, here's our last case for this one. And this is a pretty wild case. Oh, you may have seen this case before because I had it also in another one, but you know, this is a pretty good case. So if you already heard it, it won't hurt to hear it again. A man fell off his horse and became manic. When he got up, his eyes were glaring, he was raving, and he didn't follow social etiquette, which I think what it basically means is like he didn't speak respectfully to people above him. And, he, just didn't talk the way you were supposed to talk politely. He discarded his clothes and ran around, pouring out abusive language. His physical strength doubled so that 3 or 5 people couldn't hold him to tie him up. They burned talismans, they offered libations, pouring wine into the ground. They interrogated ghosts, shamans danced. None of this helped, none of this made a difference. The family wasted their wealth on cinnabar, bezoar, rhinoceros pearls, camphor, and musk until their house was empty. All very expensive herbs. So jusha cinnabar, that red mineral, bezoar is like New Huang, the like cow, what do you call it? Gallstones. Rhinoceros horn pearls, camphor, jungnao, and musk shishang. Yeah, their house. They spent all their money for cures and nothing worked, whether it was like spiritual kind of stuff or whether it was herbs. So they asked Dairen to come. And, he was traveling around, but he was not too far away at the time. So Dairen did the weirdest thing. He took a big, huge cartwheel and buried it in the ground. And then he had the axle going vertically sticking up in the air. And so two jang above it, which I don't know, is something like 2 yards, is like 6 feet or something like that. He placed a medium-sized wheel. So I didn't have any way of making a good illustration, but like one wheel is buried in the ground, and then there's an axle, and then there's another wheel high above the ground. He chiseled an indentation in the rim so the wheel was kind of like a basin. And then he tied the manic person into it face down, although there was a soft mat under him. Then he made a large person sit below and spin the wheel with a stick, turning the wheel endlessly. Oh, I hate those rides, in theme parks where you're spinning and spinning. Yeah, I hate that. So the patient vomited out 1 or 2 dough, again, like a measure of like rice, like a lot of rice. That's a big container. So he vomited out 1 or 2 dough of green, yellow, frothy saliva, liver and spleen. But you know what bothers me about this? How would you like to be the large person below while the guy who's being spun around on the wheel is vomiting? I don't think so. After spinning the wheel several times, the patient said, I can't bear this. Can you untie me? Let me down. So they untied him after he said that. He asked for cold water and they gave it to him. He drank several sheng of ice water. Again, I don't know how big a sheng is in that time, but like a quart or something, a lot. And then the mania ceased. So that's a pretty wild story. Yeah, that's a wild story, but it's fun. Anyway, this may bring up the question, how did they get ice in ancient China? I recently had a conversation with someone on Facebook who was insisting that ancient people didn't have ice, and that's why, they said ice is no good because it wasn't even something that they had. But I did a little bit of research, and they had ice cellars from the Han Dynasty and even earlier, although at that time they were for the royal family. This is an ice cellar. And they also had ice chests, like insulated containers that you could put ice in to keep it cool for a long period of time. And they would have people go, to the mountains and bring back ice and snow and pack it into these ice cellars. And, it's a technology that like ancient people used in lots of places. And in fact, like I have, like my ancestral homeland in very rural Pennsylvania in a tiny little tiny village that only ever had like 200 or 300 people, but they had a big ice house there so they could have ice in the summer. You just go and buy some ice. And so over time it wasn't any longer only the rich people who had it, but it just became a thing by this Tang and Song dynasty. You could easily get ice in, maybe, I don't know, in the farthest south of China, maybe not, but in the north of China, there was plenty of ice, even in the summer, and they made frozen desserts and drinks and stuff like that. And there's some sites will say that Marco Polo brought back the idea of ice cream to Europe, that he got it from China, but other sites say no, that's just not true. So I don't really know. But in some of the other cases, we'll see them talking about somebody buying like an icy treat in the middle of the hottest days of summer and stuff like that. So apparently, at least in certain places in China, ice was available year round, and people sometimes liked to use it. So here, like, isn't, you can look online and find this article, study on the ice cellar ruins in early ancient China. So this is about the really early ones. But this is like 1,000 years or more than 1,000 years before Zhang Zihe. And in Dairen's time, yeah, ice was available. Okay, so that's my set of cases for this week.